There are no tools of that caliber that we know of. Is this evidence for an even far greater civilization that had those tools that we have no historical record of?
Wait a second. We had a whole library full of ancient manuscripts that would have told us exactly how the ancient did it. Too bad it got burned down. Regardless, we have enough evidence left to figure out how the ancient from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex did it. And today, we will review proven methods that the Egyptians used to create their works of art, from vases to pyramids. All that I can be certain of is that I do not know everything, and thanks to this, we, the knowledge seekers, are forever driven to more and more absolute truths. Throughout their more than 3,000-year-old reign in ancient Egypt, the Africans from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex pioneered, perfected, and evolved multiple building techniques. And the fact that they had so many has caused those who are only looking for one-size-fits-all techniques to be at odds with the evidence on the ground. We will go from the pre-dynastic to the early Kemetic kings to the Middle Kingdom and the late period, and while covering the pottery, obelisks, temples, and other works of art. Experts often debate Kemetic building techniques by taking sides. Often we hear that such and such approach is not possible, and other time that it is. And often it is from people who have never been in the field, worse yet, never tried any of these construction techniques. Just like you, I love a good mystery, but above all, I love the truth. So today we will take a drastically different approach by only looking at approaches that have been reproduced with in situ tools. This means that we will look at the evolution of Kemetic building techniques only using tools and materials at the disposal of the Africans at a defined time period. And as you will see, we can obtain techniques that produce astonishing allure and precision. Of course, in the description you will find all the links and the source materials that have contributed to this video. Quick shout out to our latest members. Please do consider becoming a channel member or Patreon. These are the true heroes that help support the incredible amount of research and editing that goes into this work. From bricks to limestone to granite and alabaster. Let's go, and let's demystify part of ancient Kemet. By the way, we always leave some gems at the end of the video. Before we get too far, let's review our list of constraints and evidence that all theories must adhere to. Since there is a large body of them, we will break them down into larger categories. Number 1, it has to be logical. Number 2, it should not require a leap of faith. Number 3, it has to be economically sensible. Number 4, the process has to allow for human error while concluding in a product of extreme precision. Number 5, it has to be contemporaneous with the period attributed to these constructions and objects. Number 6, it has to fit the evidence on the ground. Number 7, above all, it has to be reproducible with the elements at Kemet's disposal. But it is important to put into context the different historical artifact that we will be discussing. Here is a timeline of ancient Egypt. You see that green dot here, way over here, well that is us right now. And here is when the pyramids were built. Back in 2650 BC, of course, temples like the Temple of Abu Simbel, Abydos, and Karnak were much later. 1265 BC, 1300 BC, and 1950 BC, respectively. But that is not the beginning of Kemet. For that we need to go back to 3100 BC, when King Narmer became the first pharaoh to unite Upper and Lower Egypt, securing the title of Nebtawi, Lord of the Two Lands. He is often considered to be the first king of Egypt. Narmer had a mortuary complex in El Ka'ab, in Egypt, in a subterranean tomb. Remember this as we will come back to King Narmer's tomb later. It plays a very important role in the evolution of construction techniques in Kemet. But before all of these, in 3400 BC, we find the pre-dynastic kings and their tombs. In Tomb Uj, this is where the oldest form of writing has ever been found, predating that of the Mesopotamians by at least 2 centuries. See our episode on this. Link in the description. And it is at Tomb Uj that we will begin our journey, in the south of Kemet, deeper south within the continent, where the Africans, having migrated from the region of the Great Lakes, now found themselves in the new fertile valley of the Nile. Migratory patterns show that the Africans from the region of the Great Lakes continued their migration northwards along the Nile, while becoming ever more sophisticated. See how the study of human pathology, specifically schistosomes, show how Africans migrated northwards and then disbanded back to Africa after the fall of Kemet. This is consistent with the cultural, oral, written, and genetic evidence. But what techniques did those Africans bring and initiate during the pre-dynastic period? Tomb Uj was built with mud bricks and was reinforced with wooden posts. This building technique would grow in importance and would serve as the basis for the next wave of building techniques during the early dynastic period. Also, a great number of clay pottery were found in Tomb Uj. Although not too remarkable in themselves, these clay pots point to the early pottery-based economy that would reach its apogee during the reign of Khufu and his pyramid building efforts. Tomb Uj is of utmost importance, as this is where we find the famous Scorpion kings, the kings that ruled ancient Egypt before the arrival of the dynastic kings, and these were in Upper Egypt, meaning the south of Egypt. But there was more than just one Scorpion king. The Scorpion King I is believed to have lived in Thinis 1 or 2 centuries before the rule of the better-known Scorpion II of Nekhen, and is presumably the first true king of Upper Egypt. To him belongs the Uj tomb found in the royal cemetery of Abydos, where Thinite kings were buried. That tomb was plundered in antiquity, but in it were found many small ivory plaques, each with a hole for tying it to something, and each marked with 1 or more hieroglyph-type scratched images, which are thought to be names of towns, perhaps to tie the offerings and tributes to keep track of which came from which town. 2 of those plaques seem to name the towns Basset and Buto, showing that Scorpion's armies had penetrated the Nile Delta. It may be that the conquests of Scorpion started the Egyptian hieroglyphic system by starting a need to keep records in writing. It is during the pre-dynastic period that we see burial mounds, the precursors to the pyramids, start popping up in the southern part of the Nubio-Kemet civilization complex. To find the original Egyptian mounds, we must travel far to the south of the Great Pyramid. In 2016, as reported by Alicia McDermott on Ancient Origins, archaeologists working near the ancient site of Abydos discovered the ruins of a settlement, including a cemetery of 15 rectangular tomb structures, which were likely covered in burial mounds or mud brick structures. However, it was the site's average radiocarbon date that shocked the team: 5316 BC. This meant that the first Egyptian burial mounds were at least 7,000 years old, millennia older than previously thought, and that pyramid evolution began over 2,700 years before the Great Pyramid. At Abydos, the tomb of Scorpion the Vunt, Tomb Uj, was excavated by Egyptologist Günter Dreyer in 1988. Scorpion I was a king of Upper Egypt who died approximately 3,320 BC, and he was buried in a large pit structure lined with mud bricks with multiple rooms filled with wealthy grave goods like ivory. It would have been covered with cedar logs and likely a large tumulus. Eventually, these mounds of sand over the burial pits were themselves covered in mud brick superstructures called mastabas, named after the Arabic word for mud bench. Mastabas are the veritable superstructures that evolved to become step pyramids and later on ziggurats. It's also important to note that mud brick construction technique remained as a staple of Egyptian building technique throughout the duration of that civilization, especially for everyday construction. In fact, it propagated to the whole region as later on, both Mesopotamian, Nubian, and Kerma, Duki Gel used this building techniques to put up impressive structures. Mud bricks are usually made of a mixture of sand, clay, water, straws. They are then sun-baked to hardness. They vary a lot in strength based on their initial composition, but as you can see, they can last up to thousands of years if you get the mixture right. Beyond clay pottery and mud brick building, the Kemetu also started to work a material that was more durable and that would require a totally different type of technique: stone. The pre-dynastic Egyptians also started making pottery out of stone, such as this dolerite vase and this ornate cosmetic palette. Absolutely exquisite. And these date back to 3300 BC. The precision and symmetry on these items is astonishing. But how did the people from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization do this? Before theorizing that it was aliens or some advanced ancient technology, let's first see if these are reproducible using conventional methods. As we will see, these methods are advanced, but they do not require advanced 21st century tech. So we have all seen examples of ancient Kemetic art, often commissioned by the nobles or those wealthy enough to afford it. But what you are looking at right now are actually examples of artifact reproduction using tools available to the Kemetu and techniques that have either been inferred from texts and drawings or reimagined. In this first example of a vase, see how the finishing and the symmetry resembles the ancient artwork. It is made of breccia marble. Although not as hard as granite and dolerite, breccia marble still ranks a 4 to 6 on the Mohs scale. Now it took this researcher 6 months to complete this vase. Of course, at this scale it would be impractical or too expensive, even with cheap labor in ancient times. But we haven't factored in specialization, which increases speed of work by at least an order of magnitude. We also need to factor in that 2 of these months were spent designing and building the tools to do the work. These would have already been present in Kemet in large quantities. Lastly, we need to account for the fact that there was a whole economy and process improvement around all of this. So every step in the process would have had hidden secrets lost to us today that would make things drastically faster and easier. When you do the same thing for millennia, you pick up a thing or two. Here is another example. Research Nikolai Vasiutin and his team set out to reproduce one of the more complex carved forms from ancient Egypt, this time out of a granite block on which they set out to engrave an Eye of Horus. For those who don't know, the Mohs scale of hardness ranks material based on their hardness. It goes from 1, which is as soft as talc, to 10, which is as hard as diamond. So if you are a pharaoh or a rich African from the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex, you want your items to last an eternity. However, the material needs to be plentiful enough that it allows for manufacture at scale. And in Kemet, granite was one of those materials of choice. It ranks between a 6, 7 on the Mohs scale of hardness. So they start the experiment by first drawing the eye. Then they use a stone with a much higher hardness scale, like dolerite, to hammer out the granite. Pretty soon, it starts to take shape. They then use some water and quartz rock for polishing. Quartz rates a 7 on the Mohs scale of hardness, but it is rare. Notice how they used a copper tool for drilling and sandstone for grinding. And all this was done in 7 hours of labor just to do the eye. Now, we know the ancient Egyptians experimented with all sorts of material, so it is good to assume that they also may have used other materials that would have increased efficiency, that along with other techniques that we are not aware of, could have theoretically cut the time in half. Although already 7 hours for such a masterpiece is not prohibitively expensive labor-wise. So how do these techniques rate against our earlier stated criteria? Well, let's start with the vase. It certainly is sensible and doesn't require a leap of faith or some magic. We only use contemporary tools. The finished product does look like it is well proportioned. But detailed measurements need to be shared in order to determine if it has the level of symmetry that the ancient had. It was definitely reproducible. The main issue remaining is the amount of time it took to complete. 4 months is a very long time. If we were to extrapolate, this would be about 720 hours. To give a sense of expense, at $30 an hour, one vase would cost $21,600. So clearly an expensive item, only affordable to the rich at this level of quality. If we also add the argument that the manufacturing process would have greatly benefited from techniques lost to us and from specializations, this cost could easily be brought down to $7,000, which is roughly 240 hours and a little over a month. These later figures seem much more reasonable. As for the eye carving, it easily matches all of our criteria. Now, these two techniques do not explain all the artifacts that one can find in the Old Kingdom and the pre-dynastic era, especially these massive stone sarcophagi, because these, aside from the challenge of carving and polishing, these present additional challenges such as moving and handling. In many cases, these 100 tons objects provide only 1 foot of clearance to the entrances they had to pass through. And this is where the approach that we know was used to build the pyramids in the early dynastic period comes into play. And it happens to be a technique that explains a lot of what has puzzled historians till today. By the time of the Third Dynasty, the dynasty of the pyramid builders, Egypt's stability and economy grew to allow for the construction of these magnificent step pyramids and pyramids. These are truly breathtaking, and I encourage anyone to go visit them in Egypt when they get a chance. Also make sure to visit the quarries when you are there, as they display some astonishing findings that we will cover in other videos. In no way was the pyramid building a cheap affair, but as I mentioned before, the Kemetu would have used the best available technique known at the time to them to build the pyramids. And for all the mystery that has been made about the construction of the pyramid, it was in fact remarkably simple. And there is evidence left all over the pyramid to indicate how it was done. In 1991, Prof. Davidovits, an expert in geopolymer, advanced the hypothesis that the Egyptians would have used a composite material to create their block, very much so like we use concrete today, and this method would have resulted in the block types that we see in Giza today. To prove his theory, he showed that the block stones in Giza had the same physical, chemical, structural, and geological properties as the synthetic blocks he created using material in situ, and to the naked eye, they were indistinguishable from the natural limestone. This is remarkable because it would indicate that the blocks from the pyramids in Giza were molded in place, a process that would have been orders of magnitude easier to execute. Here are the telltale signs that support this theory, as quoted from his articles. Professor Davidovits and his team reproduced the pyramid building process. First, the workers would have prepared areas where crushed soft limestone, abundant in the Giza Plateau, would have been mixed with water and a binding agent to create the viscous paste. The paste would have been transported on sites using buckets, easily carried. Once on the pyramid site, they would have poured the paste into place and compacted it manually. After a few days of drying, the new stone bricks would now be perfectly in place. Notice that the problem of precision is resolved, as the wooden casts allow for a guided process. Moreover, the crews can fine-tune the shape of each block once the paste is poured and compacted. Further corrections and smoothing can happen once the paste is half dried. Much has been made about the fact that the pyramid is sitting on a very level base. With the geopolymer approach, leveling the base would have become a much easier feat, assisted by gravity forces on the still liquid polymer. There is a lot of evidence that supports the geopolymer method of construction, but the most important is the following. Professor Davidovits had samples of pyramid stones analyzed, and these contained organic fibers and air bubbles that do not exist in normal situations. Let me repeat that. They found air bubbles and organic fibers in the limestone from the pyramid in Giza. This is a definitive indicator that the stone had been reconstituted. In other words, the stone was man-made. There are a lot more pieces of evidence confirming this, but I will leave the link to the video we have already done on this subject in the video description. If you like this kind of stuff, it is a must-watch. So how well does the geopolymer method fit our criteria? The geopolymer approach to pyramid building does not require any leap of faith, as all the evidence is there. It is economically sensible and fits the archaeological finding, pointing to a crew of 20,000 living in the pyramid building complex that has been discovered in recent years. In fact, using this approach, 20 years would have been plenty of time to build the pyramids. The drying of each layer of the pyramid would only take 1 or 2 days. With this approach, the working crew are allowed to perform their work without worrying about extreme precision. Each block will fit in place tightly next to the adjacent blocks, but more importantly, errors can easily be corrected. All the tools and elements needed to perform this technique were present in the time of the 3rd Dynasty pharaohs. What's more, it fits all the evidence discovered to date, from material and tools used to the written records left. The approach has been easily reproduced by Prof. Davidovits and his team many times over. They were also able to reproduce the various textures of blocks seen in Giza. Lastly, it makes sense. Africans, in their building tradition, had been using composite material for building for a long time. The first ruler of the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex, King Narmer, had his funerary complex built out of mud bricks. Although simpler in process, it is similar in approach. Incidentally, this technique is still being used all over Africa. Concrete building technique was also inherited by the Greeks in 600 BC before the Romans. When the Old Kingdom fell, Egyptian civilization fell into collapse. It is believed that during that time, temples were pillaged and violated, artwork was vandalized, and the statues of kings were broken or destroyed as a result of the postulated political chaos. Generational knowledge and expertise were lost, and nowhere is this more clear than in the loss of quality of pyramid building. Pretty much all of the pyramids of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs are now mountainous rubble. But back in their days, they would all have been architectural marvels in their own rights. See, for example, this schematics of Senwosret I's pyramid, one of my favorite. This was 201 feet high, about 61 meters. That's as tall as the Golden Gate Bridge. Although it became increasingly difficult to find money for pyramid building, the tradition of temple building did not stop. And here too, experiments were made to determine how much man-hour and material it takes to chisel a granite block with a dolerite stone. The team set out to chisel a 55-kilogram, 121 pounds, granite stone with a dolerite stone weighing 1.29 kilograms, 3 pounds. After 1 hour of pounding, 171 grams of granite was removed. Let's compare that to the time it took to make the Obelisk of Hatshepsut. In ancient text, it is said that the Obelisk of Hatshepsut took 7 months to complete. If we estimate that we have to remove 100 meters cube of material, so roughly 250 tons, we saw that we can remove about 600 grams of granite per hour. So it would take about 590 months to complete for 100 people. And that's just for one person. If we imagine 100 simultaneous workers, it would take just under 6 months to complete, which then leaves a full 2 months for polishing and transportation when we compare it to the ancient text. In terms of cost, that would be about $63,700,000 for one obelisk. Ancient Egypt back in the Middle Kingdom had an estimated population of 2 million people. So for a population that size, mobilizing 100 workers to build an obelisk for 6 months is reasonable if you either have the money, and we can assume Queen Hatshepsut did, especially given the extensive trade expansion she enabled for Kemet. The other avenue is to convince or coerce those 100 people to do the work under the guise that they would also benefit in the afterlife. All this to say that the cost of building the obelisk is not prohibitive if you know what you are doing. So, in this case, we can see that the indications left by the ancient Egyptians themselves work pretty well, and it is well within the realm of possibility. And they fit all of our criteria mentioned above. You notice that I left out the problem of transportation. There is a significant debate and a lot of unknowns still to be figured out when it comes to the ancient Egyptians' ability to transport very large stone blocks. How one moves a 100-ton stone out of the bedrock after it has been carved out presents the same level of challenges that we would have trying to move the safari boxes into the pre-dynastic burial chambers, and this is a topic that we will address in future videos. But that's not the only problem left answered by the evidence on the ground. One of the many other intrigues from Kemet was the large number of perfect drill holes left mainly used for door pivot. The cylinders extracted from Kemet show some peculiar properties. They show stripes that look machine-like. In addition, they seem to be slightly wider at the bottom of the cylinder, which is very puzzling. That is because any drill bit would create a perfect cylinder as it travels through the stone. Researcher Nikolai Vasiutin built a replica of an ancient Egyptian drill, as was shown on the temple walls. The drill head is made of copper, and he used a mixture of sand and water in between the granite stone and the copper. This is the same technique we saw when doing the iris. Notice how the slanted shape of the handle allows for very fast rotation of the whole drill. It takes getting used to, but as you can see, a seasoned driller can easily achieve a drill speed of 40 rotations per 10 seconds, or 240 revolutions per minute. After 1 hour of drilling, they use a wedge to break off the cylinder from the hole. In 1 hour, they were able to drill 49.8 millimeters, or about 2 inches. This is remarkable. With ingenuity and the right material, even stone can be drilled through with machine-like precision. Interestingly, the removed cylinder bears the same properties as the ones found in the Nubio-Kemetic civilization complex. Both the characteristic grooves are present, but even more interesting, the base of the cylinder is slightly wider than the top. Nikolai and his team explain that this happens because the drill oscillates when it rotates, and that causes a bit of stone material to be removed along the cylinder. One more interesting thing, it has been stated multiple times that copper cannot cut through stone, and that eventually the copper drill will become dull. In fact, we not only see that this is possible, but we also see that the drill bit itself becomes sharper over time. Take a look for yourself. We don't know everything yet about how the Africans from Kemet did what they were able to, but if these examples are any indication, the Kemetu evolved multiple techniques for building. Some of these techniques can be qualified as industrial, and it wouldn't be too far off, given the large population, the level of specialization they achieved. Did they have some other way of powering their tooling that we haven't devised yet? Maybe. But certainly they had a different technology vector, one that was focused on working stone, and they were very, very good at it. If you haven't seen them yet, here are 3 documentaries on our channel that you don't want to miss. The first one deals with the largest civilization in history and how Africans spread civilization throughout the globe. In the second documentary, we explore all the mathematical innovations pioneered by the Africans in ancient times, from numeracy to algebra. The third documentary, we dispel the myth that Mesopotamia was the cradle of civilization. You'll find the links in the description. Again, a huge thank you to all those who are making this content possible by supporting us. Please consider becoming a supporter of this channel via YouTube or Patreon. Join us and see how those who are said to be without history birthed civilization itself.